Let's talk for a bit about what happened to the Abbasid. I might get some of these names wrong. I'm just going to breeze past it. Sorry in advance if I'm getting these names wrong, the pronunciation of these names wrong. If I can't even pronounce pronunciation right, you should know that I'm going to get these 800-year-old Middle Eastern and Asian dynasties and rulers' names wrong during this all. But let's talk right now about what happened to the Abbasid rulers of Iraq who decided to challenge the Mongol hordes. So dig in, dig deep, and embrace for impact. This is the story of how wealth and security can make you weak and vulnerable. How physical, temporary treasures will lead you astray and distance you from God's protection. For those focused on their worldly titles, reputations, possessions, and pleasures, cannot truly be focused on keeping one's soul close to the Creator or loving and fearing Him alone. An Iraqi historian from the 14th century summed up the siege and fall of Baghdad with these words: "Even a brief mention of it would be terrible to hear. How much worse its recapitulation in detail. Things happen which I shall not record. Imagine them and do not ask me for a full description." When the historians are too scared to document the reality that took place, that should bring up some red flags and some questions in your head. Again, thanks everyone on Instagram for tuning in and waving. Head over to dlive.tv/seanvplanet because this is going to cut off in about a half hour. But yeah, so let's get into it. Despite the historical importance and many lessons to be learned, the story of Baghdad's fall has been poorly reserved by historians, mostly due to the destruction of the Iraqi libraries, universities, mosques, art, and literature following their defeat. The Abbasid Caliphate was plagued by political intrigues, civil wars, lust, greed, wrath, gluttony, and a government weakened by immorality. Thirst for grandeur by the caliphs destroyed them, led to their destruction. As well as floods and fires that devastated Baghdad, and sectarian and civil violence between its own residents resulting from a distracted, divided, and corrupted ruling class. Does that sound familiar? That sound familiar at all? A society that has a corrupt and abusive ruling class that is leading their society into all sorts of sins and eventually their own destruction. I'll read that again. The Abbasid Caliphate was plagued by political intrigues, civil wars, lust, greed, wrath, gluttony, and a government weakened by immorality, by their thirsts for grandeur, as well as floods and fires that devastated Baghdad, and sectarian and civil violence between its own residents resulting from a distracted, divided, and corrupted ruling class. In 1242, al-Mustasim succeeded to the position of caliph. And I know it's caliph. I usually say caliph. Sorry, again, if I mispronounce that. I'm not doing it on purpose. Not knowing that he would be the last Abbasid to rule in Baghdad. Historians depicted him as, quote, devoted to entertainment and pleasure, passionately addicted to playing with birds, and dominated by women. He was a man of poor judgment, irresolute, and neglectful of what is needed for the conduct of government. He was a man with insatiable appetites, enslaved by his pleasures, misguided and blinded by his many sins. Another chronicler summed up the caliph this way: undoubtedly, he was not fit for kingship, and greatness was beyond him. Undoubtedly, he was not fit for kingship, and greatness was beyond him. And the caliph's court was no better, often portrayed as being a bunch of schemers who spent their time indulging in temporary pleasure and wasted their energy fighting each other for worldly status. Meanwhile, as all this is taking place, meanwhile, the Mongol ruler Monkey Khan was preparing for world conquest. The Mongol horde was Roman, as the Iraqis were sitting around indulging in pleasures. And unfortunately for them, Iraq stood in the center of their new expansion plans in the Middle East. Previously, the Abbasid Caliph had given small gestures of wealth to the Mongols, but Monkey was seeking more direct rule over the region, so he gave his brother Hulagu, he gave his brother Hulagu command of 200,000 men, with orders to conquer everything that laid before the Nile River. Monkey told his brother Hulagu, quote, "If the Caliph of Baghdad comes out to pay homage, harass him in no way whatsoever. If he is prideful and his heart and tongue are not one, let him join the others," by which he means completely destroy them. By the end of 1256, the Mongols had conquered most of Iran and Afghanistan and began heading for the borders of the Abbasid Caliphate. Before launching his campaign, Hulagu sent envoys and letters urging the Abbasid ruler to submit. They came with the typical threat. Quote, when I lead my troops against Baghdad, even if you hide in the sky or in the earth, I shall not leave one person alive in your realm, and I shall put your city and country to the torch. This prideful, unking-like caliph had his rhetoric ready in response. You can come with strategy, troops, and lasso, but how are you going to capture a star? Does the prince not know that from east to west, from king to beggar, from old to young, all who are God-fearing and God-worshipping are servants of this court and soldiers in my army? The caliphate began assembling and preparing defense forces. Kurdish armies were bought, mercenaries from Syria and Egypt were brought in, but they would not add much value to the strength of an idol-worshipping kingdom. Hulagu began his preparations for invasion and convinced surrounding kingdoms in Armenia and Georgia to assist out of fear. And he also approached the ruler of Mosul for support. Years earlier, this same ruler had sworn fealty to the ruler of Mosul, which was like a city-state at the time, not part of Iraq. He also approached the ruler of Mosul, and years earlier, this same ruler had sworn fealty to both the Mongols and the Abbasids. And with war coming, he had to make his choice on which side to join. One writer records that it was at this time that two envoys arrived to meet this ruler, one from the Mongols and the other from Baghdad. Each made a demand from Mosul. The Mongols asked for catapults and siege equipment, while the Caliph wanted him to send a band of musicians to Baghdad. After hearing from both envoys, the ruler of Mosul turned to his followers and said, "Look at the two requests and weep for Islam and its people." The Mongols set out with a combined force of about 200,000 men, which was split into several groups, each of which moved quickly and headed towards Baghdad from a different direction. This created confusion among the Iraqi defenders, who scrambled to return their initial defense forces back to the capital. The Iraqi army eventually encountered the first wave of Mongol forces about 30 miles outside of Baghdad, and the Abbasid army defeated this group. The army did not pursue the defeated force and decided instead to celebrate their victory with eating and drinking outside in the fields. sending a message back to the Caliph saying, "I defeated all of them, and tomorrow I will do away with the few survivors." But the Mongols who were defeated, guess what happened next? But the Mongols who were defeated were only a very small recon troop that had been sent ahead to scout the Abbasid army. Before the end of the day, the main force had arrived. While night passed, the Mongols encircled the Iraqi troops and destroyed several dikes and canals. When the Iraqi forces awoke the next day, they found themselves in dire circumstances, as water began flooding into the area all around them. The Mongols now, at this point, attacked in full force, and the Abbasid army was routed at once. 12,000 soldiers were killed or drowned, while it was reported that only 3, count them, 1, 2, 3, total surviving men made it back to Baghdad. Needless to say, no further attempts were made to engage the Mongols outside of the city walls, and work began on preparing the city's defenses. 80,000 men were used to defend the city and caliphate royalty. To make matters worse, tens of thousands of refugees were swarming into the city, trying to keep ahead of the advancing Mongol armies. The city food supplies became quickly depleted. The streets became crowded and filled with garbage. A week later, Hulagu and his forces converged on the outskirts of Baghdad, and the city was completely encircled. The Mongols did not immediately attack Baghdad. Instead, they built their own moats and walls to protect their catapults and siege machines. During this construction effort, defeat and death became obvious, and the Caliph made an attempt to obtain a truce. He sent gifts and possessions to the Mongol leader, but those were rejected. He sent gifts and possessions to the Mongol leader, but those were rejected. The attack began about a week later. The western part of Baghdad, which had no walls, fell on the first day of fighting. The inhabitants there likely welcomed the Mongols instead of fighting them. They had had enough with the rule of the caliphs, the greed and gluttony and the sin of the caliphs, and welcomed the Mongols who were invading them instead of fighting them. The Mongols began using catapults to destroy the walls and defense posts, and tied messages to arrows that were fired into the city, promising no harm would come to several groups of people, including the Shiite Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, the merchants, the scholars, and anyone else not involved in fighting. One sec. With the Mongols now in control of the walls, Hulagu did something very interesting. He had his men just sit there. He broke through the walls, he destroyed their outside defenses, their physical defenses. He had his men climb on top of the walls, and they just sat there. No attempt was made to go into the city. The commander is recorded as saying, "The Caliph, quote, the Caliph can do what he wants. If he wants, let him come out. If not, let him not come out. But the Mongol troops will remain on those walls where they are until they do come out." Fighting in general continued for a few days along the outside of the city, on the outside of the city defenses. But groups of Baghdad soldiers, civilians, and courtiers began to abandon the city and surrender. Some were granted amnesty, while high-ranking government officials and military leaders were taken away and executed. The Caliph stubbornly remained in his palace, unsure of what to do, but his advisors convinced him that his only chance of survival was to surrender, in hopes that maybe he would be given another chance to rule the city following defeat. His physical life and earthly power were the only thing of importance to him, so he decided to walk out of Baghdad with his family and 3,000 courtiers to surrender to the Mongols. Now we get into the lessons to be learned. The Caliph soon met with Hulagu, who did not display any anger at the Caliph, but instead asked him about his health. He then requested all of the people inside of the city to throw down their weapons and come out so that they may be counted. Thousands marched outside of the city and gave up their weapons. Once all of them were disarmed, the Mongols drew their swords and attacked all of the defenseless soldiers. Not one was spared. The Caliph looked upon this all with horror, weeping, regretting that he did not continue to fight, and is claimed to have said to himself, quote, "My enemy has succeeded. I have fallen into a snare like a clever little bird." Once the Caliph's army was destroyed, like completely destroyed, every single one of them, Baghdad was sacked and pillaged for a week or two. Tens of thousands, if not 100 or hundreds of thousands, were killed. Some estimate that nearly 1 million Iraqis in total were killed as a result of this war and conquest. Merchants, Christians, Shiites, Jews, and scholars were likely spared, but forced to pay tributes and bend the knee to Mongol rule. And after the dust settled, Hulagu had to decide the fate of the Caliph, his family, and the royal court. The Mongol leader entered the city and went into the Caliph's main residence. He was summoned, and Hulagu said to him, "You are the host, and we are the guests. Bring whatever you have that is suitable for us." So the terrified Caliph had hundreds of precious items presented to Hulagu, who in turn distributed them to his officers. The Mongol leader then turned to the Caliph and gave him a golden tray and ordered him to eat it. But the Caliph replied that it was not edible. "Then why did you keep it?" asked Hulagu, "and not give it to your soldiers? And why did you not make these iron doors into arrowheads and come to the bank of the river so that I may not have been able to cross it?" The Caliph had no answer other than, "Such was God's will." To which the Mongol leader replied, "What will befall thee is also God's will." It was decided that this Caliph should be executed to prevent a future rebellion of neighboring Muslim armies, and so too was his entire family. The cause of execution is disputed, but it is likely that he was rolled into a carpet or tied in a sack before being kicked to death. The Mongols believed that if they spilled royal blood onto earth, it would bring them misfortune. So this method of capital punishment was typical. Excuse me. There is an alternative story, however, provided by Marco Polo, in which Hulagu has the Caliph locked into a tower filled with all of his gold. All of his gold, all of his pearls, and all of his other riches. Then the Mongol rulers told the Caliph, "Now eat your fill of treasure, since you are so fond of it, for you will get nothing else," before leaving him alone in the tower to succumb to hunger and thirst. And I'm going to read this takeaway from, this is kind of a summarized version of Owen Benjamin's thoughts on this story. But the Iraqis had 500 years of gold. 500 years of success and victory, and the spoils of war were encased, enshrined, and worshipped by the ruling class of this empire, which had a long period of relaxed and prosperous times. When the evil descended upon them, they were unable to fight off that evil. They were too satisfied, too whole, too weakened by their comforts and ease. I don't know what just happened. They were generally just too blinded by their sins. 200,000 strong, relentless, skilled butchers on horseback came from faraway lands and were able to conquer entire empires and slaughter entire cities like Baghdad that were estimated to have 800,000 to potentially 2 million citizens. How could a force so small conquer and slaughter a population so big and, quote, civilized? They weren't defeated fairly on a battlefield. There was no trade agreement established. There was no, as we were talking about earlier, demoralization that needed to take place. The Abbasids were defeated before the Mongol hordes ever entered their lands. Defeated by their vices, by their lust, their greed, their jealousy, and their willingness to worship false idols and worship the temporary safety and stuff they had acquired in the past. Their comforts, ease, pleasures, and possessions had made them weak, docile, complacent, ignorant, and unable to see the reality facing them. As they starved the Caliph, the Mongols asked why he hoarded all of his gold when he could have fed his soldiers instead. Why would he have made metal fences when he could have forged weapons? And Owen does ask, why does evil seem to always win? Why does it seem that evil always wins? Why do the children of the lie seem so powerful and dangerous? Well, when sin defeats you, when it overtakes your soul, now or later, your sins, those sins you choose to indulge yourself in, the appetites you choose to indulge yourself in, all of your sins will distance you from God and thus his protection. And it will leave you vulnerable to the schemes and the snares of Satan. When you are not putting on the armor of God, when you are distancing yourself from God by disobeying him, you will be left vulnerable to the schemes and snares of Satan. When you replace God as your only source of truth, love, and fear with the things of this earth, for the things of this earth, you become unprotected from the spiritual forces that seek to bring you down. Evil will defeat you whenever you put down God's armor and pick up the safety and stuff of this world. Satan will overwhelm you when you abandon God and walk away from the righteous path. Evil does not always win. It actually does not win in the end. And evil doesn't always win here and now. It just seems that way when you are looking out at this life through sinful eyes. When your heart is full of anger, fear, and despair, it seems like evil always wins. It just looks that way when your glasses are shaded by sin. When you have a tint of sin in your eyes, that's how it seems. But when people truly do choose to do things for the glory of God, when people maintain their connection to God, when they wholeheartedly choose to advance his kingdom, evil loses every time. Every time. Like a butter knife through warm butter. It's like evil loses every time. The battle is not hard when you choose to do and live a life for the glory of God and not for yourself. People often want to act holy. They want other people to think that they are righteous. They want the pleasures and the comforts, the good feelings and the positive emotions. They want all the good without any of the bad. They don't want to do any of the hard work, accept the truth, or truly submit to God and obey him at all times. The Iraqis thought that they were so holy. Their riches proved that. Their riches, their pleasures, their comforts, their safety, their victories proved to them that God favored them. And they quickly became intellectuals and priests, and they indulged in pleasure and feasted upon their earthly appetites. They talked about loving and fearing God, while they truly loved and feared themselves. Then the rivers ran black with ink and red with blood. Their lack of dedication, trust in, and love for God alone caused their destruction. They were left vulnerable to the forces of evil. They relied on themselves and not their Creator to provide and protect. You must have discipline. You must have discipline. You must have clear vision. You must have drive, time, and energy, all of which dedicated to God and His right ways. Your works, your faith, your life, it must be dedicated entirely to advancing God's kingdom and entering into it. Not focused on, addicted to, or worshiping the safety and stuff in this temporary world. You must dedicate your life to God and His glory. Otherwise, you will end up holding golden plates in your fancy houses as evil forces slaughter your family and friends. You will be pointing to all of your possessions and pleasures when God asks you why you deserve a place in His kingdom. Stop worshiping false idols. Return to God and His right ways. Do not set your heart on this world, or else this world will take it. Be in this world for now, and not of this world for good. Live for His glory, and reject all the safety and stuff of this place. It is not your home. It is not your home. Abandon your safety and stuff and return to God and His right ways.